As we established a few weeks ago, there are a lot of planes that were manufactured during World War II, and only a handful got really famous. But that doesn't mean that the others weren't, worth talking about. A lot of them were genuinely good and served very well. They just didn't stand the test of time in terms of name recognition. And due to the slightly surprising, I must admit, success of my initial list regarding this, I got a ton of different suggestions for a future installment. So much that I decided to just jump right on that. Because you guys have a lot of great ideas for even more aircraft that don't get the same kind of recognition as others do. And I aim to please, and I certainly am all for talking about more ridiculously obscure, yet noteworthy aircraft when it comes to World War II. And as with the first list, the rule is that they had to have been manufactured and entered service during the course of the war. So, no random experimental stuff that didn't actually, at least enter service with a squadron. Also, I should probably clarify, entered service. I don't necessarily mean actually fight. A lot of people pointed that out with the Bearcat, that it never actually fought in World War II, but it was in service. Never had the chance to shoot anything, but it was there, so I gave it a bit of a pass on the grounds that I just really wanted to talk about it. So we're going to stick with that rule, that it has to have entered service, even if it didn't get to flex its full capabilities during the course of the conflict. Let's talk about 5 more criminally overlooked aircraft from World War II. The Martin 187 Baltimore. This was a twin-engined light attack bomber built by the Glenn L. Martin Company in the United States, and sometimes it's referred to as the A-30. As some of you pointed out, it does seem like if it starts with an A in its designation, it tends to get ignored when it comes to World War II. A lot of ground attack aircraft tend to fall by the wayside when you compare them to, say, the fighters or the outright bombers. If it was an A, it was like, what's that? What is that thing? We don't even talk about those. Look, get that out of here. Psh, boring. But that's not entirely fair, as they were doing a very important job. Light ground attack roles and precision strikes were very critical to the war effort, and still is to this day. Especially when you were trying to hit a target that required precision that the usual bombing run practices of just chuck a whole bunch out there and hope for the best simply couldn't provide. But the Baltimore actually got ignored by America, despite being produced by us. The United States Armed Forces didn't see a need for the type, at least when it came to them, but a lot of our allies did. The British RAF, the Royal Canadian Air Force, the Royal Australian Air Force, and the South African Air Force all saw use in the Baltimore. And that's actually why it wound up being labeled the A-30, as originally it was called the A-23, but in order for it to be supplied under the Lend-Lease Act to the British, they changed it to A-30. A total of 1,575 of this plane were produced. They had a crew of 4, a pilot, navigator/bombardier, radio operator, and a gunner. They had a maximum speed of 305 miles per hour, a cruise speed of 224 miles per hour, and a range of 980 miles. I put them low on the list because early on, they actually suffered some problems, and only some of those were ever really resolved. The biggest issue seems to be landing and taking off, interestingly enough. Crews complained about the cramped conditions on board, but that wasn't really any different from pretty much every other kind of aircraft in this particular role. But they didn't handle well on the ground, so on takeoff, the pilot had to be very precise with his throttle settings to avoid a nose-over, and landing required a high approach speed. However, once they were in the air, they were actually really good. Their performance was exceptional. They carried a heavy armament for their size, had excellent structural strength, maneuverability, as well as bombing accuracy. And it was found that they were optimal for medium altitude bombing, because they actually suffered pretty heavy losses early on, because in North Africa, in order to stop Rommel's advance, they just threw the Baltimore out for low-level attacks. But that was a bad idea. Most of those missions didn't have escort fighters with them either, so many squadrons got ripped apart, but that wasn't really the Baltimore's fault. It was more of a misallocation of them. When they were reassigned for medium bombing runs, they did a lot better, and could also do reconnaissance roles, target towing, maritime patrol, as well as night intruder roles. But despite the fact that nearly 1,600 were made, not a single one of these planes was held for preservation. Seriously, not one. which is actually pretty rare for World War II aircraft. Usually at least one would have been held in a museum at some point, but not in the Baltimore's case, which I imagine only contributes to why people don't really know about this plane. It's definitely unfortunate because they did deserve better. The Westland Whirlwind. In yet another inclusion of British fighters with really cool names, the Whirlwind was a twin-engined fighter developed by Westland Aircraft. It was a contemporary of the Spitfire and the Hurricane, and it was actually the first single-seat, twin-engined, cannon-armed fighter for the Royal Air Force. They first flew in 1938, and at that time, they were one of the fastest combat aircraft in the world. And since it had 4 20mm autocannons in its nose, it was also the most heavily armed. They were absolute beasts and very impressive from a technological perspective, but they only saw very limited service during World War II, and they'd only make 114. Why is that? Well, this particular plane was not held back due to a lack of interest or capabilities. It was mostly due to economic issues as well as their engines. See, the Whirlwind as a plane was completely designed around utilizing the Rolls-Royce Peregrine, which was a 21-liter, 885 horsepower liquid-cooled V12 Aero engine. Those engines were very good for the time, but development issues with them held back the plane. The design, in fact, was so reliant on this blasted engine that Westland couldn't even swap it out for something else. The other engines they had were larger and would have required extensive redesigns of the plane to the point that it wouldn't even be a Whirlwind anymore, and certainly wouldn't have had the same capabilities. This problem held back the Whirlwind quite a bit, and the other issue was basic economics, at least in the war situation. See, the UK was kind of struggling with their supply chains just a little bit, because a big component of the German assault on them was to cut off their supply lines. Getting access to advanced materials was pretty difficult, so what they really needed at the time was capable but also cheap planes. And the thing about the Whirlwind is that in order to build a single one, it required 3 times as much alloy as a single Spitfire. So basically, not only was it difficult getting access to the engines they desperately needed to actually, make the planes fly, but even building them in general was the same cost as building 3 Spitfires. And Spitfires are great planes, so based on this, you can kind of see why the Whirlwind fell by the wayside, which is unfortunate because they are excellent planes. A maximum speed of 360 miles per hour at 15,000 feet. A range of 800 miles, but they just didn't have the means to make them, so other aircraft flew in their place. The Bristol Type 156 Beaufighter, another British aircraft produced in way higher numbers than the Whirlwind, because they actually could build these things. These planes served not only the Royal Air Force, but also the Canadian Air Force and the Australian Air Force, sometimes just called the Beau. This is a multi-role aircraft, developed by Bristol, first flying in 1939. And when I say they were multi-role, I mean they were really multi-role. In a similar case to the A-20 that we talked about last time, the Beaufighter could pretty much do whatever you wanted. Their only real weak spot is that, by fighter standards, they were pretty heavy and slow. They only had a maximum speed of 335 miles per hour, and a weight of 16,000 pounds, which made them a little bit unwieldy for that, but they were still small enough that they could be jostled around if the pilot had to. And there were an insane number of variants, and a total of 5,928 of the Beaufighters were made, seeing service all over the world. Even us here in the United States actually utilized them for 4 of our squadrons. They were excellent aircraft, though they tend to get overshadowed by the more famous Mosquitoes. Fortunately though, partially due to their prevalence, there are a ton held for preservation that you can see in many museums all over the place. And even after the war was over, they were still retained in service until 1960. Not that bad at all for a plane that you just don't see get brought up very often. The Yakovlev Yak-3. Comrades. I got a few comments last time that pointed out that I had completely omitted Russia from my list. That wasn't on purpose, it just kinda came together that way. And I guess a few of you do want me to talk about the fighters that were made by those filthy communists! So okay, alright, we'll do that. Because it is true that Soviet fighters in general, especially here in the West, tend to not get talked about that much. But they do deserve some attention, and the Yak-3 definitely does, because it is arguably the best plane they made in general during that time. They built 4,848 of these things, and it was a single-engine, single-seat fighter plane. They were one of the smallest and lightest combat fighters that was fielded by anyone during the war, but that gave it a very high power-to-weight ratio, giving it excellent performance, especially at low altitude. They were also very easy to maintain, so that coupled with the performance meant that both pilots and ground crews loved the things. They were exactly what the Soviets needed at the time, and they were introduced in June of 1944. These planes had a maximum speed of 401 miles per hour, and a range of 340 miles. Technically speaking, they could fly as high as 10,400 meters, 34,100 feet, but that wasn't done very often. Their best positioning was lower altitude fights, to the point that the Luftwaffe straight up told their pilots not to engage these things at lower than 5,000 meters. Seriously, they told their pilots not to fight them at that height, ever, because their performance wasn't to be questioned. They were really good, to the point that even the Luftwaffe was like, wow, absolutely not. So even if you have an issue with the Soviet Union, and believe me, as someone who studies history, I get that, the design and performance of the Yak-3 is definitely worthy of praise. So popular are they that there's even multiple modern reproductions of them. So yes, indeed, excellent work, comrades. The Kawasaki Ki-100. Is it Kai or Ki? I've heard both. I'm gonna say Kai because I think it sounds better. But this is one of those things I'm saying that I feel like is going to get corrected in the comments, and then everyone's gonna descend into a massive argument over it. But is it worth it, people? Ask yourself that. Because we all know which one I'm talking about. Or, actually, maybe you don't. These are pretty obscure planes. So obscure, this is one of only a handful of Japanese aircraft that was not assigned an Allied codename. This plane came about from the already pretty good Ki-61s as an emergency measure in early 1945. The Japanese were starting to get bombed, like, where they lived, in the home islands, and they really needed something to stop that. As such, they decided to modify the 61s to take a 14-cylinder Mitsubishi Ha-112-2 radial engine in place of their original Kawasaki inline. While that seems like a very simple modification, it actually resulted in one of the best interceptors that was used by the Japanese army during the war. It combined both excellent power and maneuverability, causing the planes to actually distinguish themselves, at least among the Japanese that were utilizing them even that late in the conflict. It performed better than pretty much any of their contemporaries, and could attack American B-29s, as well as go toe-to-toe with P-51 Mustangs and F-6F Hellcats, which, if you know anything about those two planes, is not a sentence you get to say very often. But only 396 wound up being produced, and that was mostly because the war was almost over by that point. The Japanese were on the defense by a significant margin, and their supply lines had basically been cut, hence why they were modifying planes they already had to begin with. It just turned out that one change made them amazing. Their maximum speed was 360 miles per hour, added to a range of 870 miles, and they could climb to a height of 36,000 feet. Fast, maneuverable, they were intimidating planes. They just didn't show up soon enough for it to matter much. But there is at least one known survivor, located at the RAF Museum in Hendon, in the United Kingdom. For years, it was actually misidentified as a Ki-43, but after realizing what exactly they had, it went back on display as of December 2022. So you can see this obscure and excellent aircraft if you want. And with that, a special thank you goes out to all my underwater train finders, Some Dude 267, Orange Glass, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, Tommy Rossini, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Brian, Jack Carson's Railroad Videos, Lord R444, Mark Holding, Murder Drone Stall, A Person 723, DM Tribal Typhoon, Royal Hudson 2860, Eisner for 1405, Charles Kwiatkowski, Matthew Wolf, Matt Weaver, Tom Red Lion, Ennis Productions 8104, Hannah Bird, Hendrick Motorsports Fan 5, Wheeljack 8401, Rescues Greyhounds, The Baxter, Kayla Crosswhite, Ohio Trucker 1, Joshua Long, Andrew Bowen, Dr. Racer 78, Josh Johnson, Hayden DeGrow, Travis Stolinsky, Caleb Rainwaters, Prez Trenton, Master of None, Oklahoma Hot Rail, and Liam Wright. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.